This week, we're looking at the global muckrakers whose reporting has made a difference. This can happen in a variety of ways. Sometimes the reporting stirs up global outrage, and that forces change. Sometimes, as the economist Alexander Dyke has shown us, naming and shaming a company can produce results. A company that cares about its reputation often responds to bad press. Sometimes the press coverage pushes the company to investigate and take action. Sometimes the company responds by starting its own campaign or putting pressure on journalists to tell a different story. Or companies might sue. And then we look to the courts to uphold laws that protect freedom of expression. Bear all of these possible different outcomes in mind as we speak today about Henry Wood Nevinson, a campaigning journalist who wrote for Harper's Monthly magazine. Nevinson wrote about slavery and investigated slavery in Sao Tome and Principe on the cocoa plantations that supplied to Cadbury's chocolate company. Before we talk more about Nevinson, we'll describe a bit about the time in which he was writing. After slavery was banned in the U.S. and England, and after the slave trade was abolished, indentured servitude became a common way for employers to get cheap labor without calling it slavery. Demand for many commodities was soaring in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as countries industrialized. So was demand for cocoa. 3 British companies, Fry, Rowntree, and Cadbury, bought much of the global cocoa supply and manufactured chocolate. They marketed chocolate as a healthy alternative to alcohol. A lot of what we know about this period and the journalism about the Cadburys comes from 2 books by Catherine Higgs and Lowell Sater. The thing to remember about these cocoa-producing families is that they were Quakers, and the Quakers had always been very involved in the anti-slavery movement. The Cadbury family in particular had funded the Anti-Slavery Society in England and some of the newspapers that campaigned against slavery. They had also funded E.D. Morel in his campaign for better conditions in the Congo. The Cadburys manufactured chocolate in the town of Bournville in the north of England, and they had tried to make Bournville a model village with good labor conditions. This was an exception in the late 19th and early 20th century during this period of industrialization. The Cadburys provided housing for their workers, fair wages, and decent hours. But far away in the land of Sao Tome and Principe, a Portuguese colony just off the coast of West Africa, there were rumors of child labor and exploitation of the workers who picked the cocoa beans that supplied the Cadbury Cocoa Company. Remember how hard information was to get in the 19th and 20th century? The global muckraker spent so much time trying to verify information and get the facts of what was actually happening. Rumors were spreading back to the Cadburys in England, and they just weren't sure what to do. They agonized about the reports they received, and they wondered whether they were actually true. The Cadburys finally decided they would send Joseph Burt over to Sao Tome and Principe to see firsthand what the conditions were like. Burt was an interesting character. A former bank clerk, Burt had lived in a utopian community in the north of England. But he was not a journalist, and he did not speak Portuguese. First, Burt spent a year in Porto in Portugal learning Portuguese, and then he took a boat to Sao Tome and Principe. Higgs describes how Burt arrived in Sao Tome, and he wrote letters back to the Cadburys saying everything looked fine. The kids had big bellies. It did not occur to him, apparently, that those children were malnourished. Burt traveled around Sao Tome visiting plantations and enjoying the hospitality. It really shows once again that for global muckrakers to do their job, they need to be free to travel independently and not be beholden to sources that want to shape their reporting. Meanwhile, journalist Henry Wood Nevinson went on his own, first to Angola, where most of the workers came from, and then to Sao Tome and Principe to see what he could find out about the conditions there. In London, H.R. Fox Bourne and Travers Buxton, 2 prominent anti-slavery campaigners, told Nevinson of the rumors they had heard of slavery in the Portuguese colonies of Angola and on the island of Sao Tome and Principe. Nevinson had had an illustrious career. He'd been a center of many of the big stories of the time. He'd been a war correspondent in Greece and during the Boer War in South Africa. And after Africa, he spent time in Russia before their revolution. But Sao Tome and Principe had a big effect on him, and he never forgot the conditions there, tried so hard to raise the alarm about the conditions. Nevinson sent off for Africa in one of the Elder Dempster ships, and you may remember Elder Dempster because they were Morell's employer before he quit to become a global muckraker. As Nevinson traveled, he looked for signs of labor abuse and slavery. Technically, the workers recruited in Angola were free men and women who signed 5-year contracts to work in São Tomé and Príncipe, but Nevinson came to believe that this was a lie. In Angola, he found traces of slavery everywhere. He spent months walking the route that contracted workers, often wearing wooden shackles, had followed from deep in Angola's interior. At Catumbela on the coast, Nevinson visited the old slave market. Now, many of these newly contracted workers were passing there on their way to São Tomé and Príncipe. Like Dwarkanath Ganguly, Nevinson knew the contracts that the workers were given were not honored. He called the scene a pitiless farce. The workers were not being sent home at the end of their contract, and runaways were shot, Nevinson wrote. At one point on his journey to São Tomé, Nevinson was actually on a boat that carried slaves. He describes that near the port of Ambriz in what is now Angola, one of the slaves saw land, and realizing it was near his home district, he jumped off the boat, trying to swim ashore. Immediately, a small boat was dropped off the side, and within 10 minutes, 2 men and an officer battered the escaped slave with sticks. They tied him up, they brought him back on the ship, and they chained him to a post while the passengers called for this slave to be flogged. A lot of money was wrapped up in the business of cocoa, and Nevinson writes that civilized people may whine and blubber over imaginary sufferings in plays and novels, but touch their comfort, touch their property, they are rattlesnakes then. Nevinson returned to London in 1905. Harper's had published his series of articles in 1905 and early 1906. They appeared as a book in 1906 too. Then Nevinson went off to Russia and India, and while he was away, not much happened, and he was extremely disappointed. This quote from Nevinson describes the disappointment that journalists often feel when they write what they think is a major story and they just get a sort of tepid response. I had imagined that the British detestation of slavery would be aroused, that our government would make representations to Portugal on the subject, and that our Quaker cocoa firms would boycott the raw material derived from such an abominable source, and that there would be a general stir among honorable and influential newspapers. Nothing of the kind happened. We've included this quote because it's timeless. Many muckrakers have experienced this feeling of their work being ignored. What happened next is a long story, but we'll just summarize. The Cadburys delayed taking action, and they put off publishing Bert's report. Political factors came into play because South Africa was a British colony, and the Portuguese supplied workers from Africa to the South African mines. Nothing much was happening, and people, including journalists, were waiting for action. In April and May 1908, a number of articles started appearing in the British newspapers asking, why are the Cadburys still buying cocoa from São Tomé? In each case, Higgs tells us, the Cadburys sought and secured apologies from the Manchester Guardian, the Standard, and the Evening Standard. In September 1908, however, the Standard published an editorial praising the Cadbury workers for the care they show to the, quote, white hands of the Bourneville chocolate makers, and asking why the same consideration was not shown to, quote, the African hands whose toil is essential to the Cadbury operations. This time, the papers refused to apologize, and the Cadbury brothers sued the newspaper for libel. In the company's libel suit against the Standard, the court sided with the Cadburys, but awarded them only a farthing, that's a quarter of a penny in damages, although the newspaper did have to pay for the company's court costs. The court's tiny award of damages shows it was not very sympathetic to the Cadburys, and much of the public was losing patience as well. They were sending letters to the Cadburys asking what was going on, and they were marking up their advertisements with critical comments. By 1909, the Cadburys finally decided to boycott cocoa from São Tomé and Príncipe, but it's worth acknowledging that the company had already secured another source of imports of cocoa. This cocoa was farmed by free African farmers in the British colony of the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. By 1914, British representatives in Luanda, Angola, reported that contract workers from Sao Tome and Principe were returning home with wages paid from the repatriation fund set up by Portuguese cocoa planters. However, the problem of bad labor conditions on cocoa plantations continues into the 21st century. Journalists still write about this subject. What are the lessons for global muckrakers? It can take a long time for change to happen. Journalists need to cover a story repeatedly. One story usually doesn't bring about change. Calling attention to problems through journalism can do a lot, but it can't solve everything. Larger questions of injustice and economic opportunities are harder to fix. Labor abuses are common, and journalists need to return to the same places and the same subjects over and over again in order to monitor what happens after they do their original reporting.